Welcome to Native Bidaske, Native News Online's weekly spotlight on the people making news and leading change in Indian country.
Welcome to another episode of Native Bidaske. I'm Levi Rickert, your host for today's show. And today we're celebrating across the United States the 4th of July, Independence Day. Now, the 4th of July is a national holiday that many Native Americans have a hard time celebrating, quite frankly. The reasons vary, but one reason is the holiday is a reminder of so much of what has been lost to tribal communities throughout the United States. That they lost it to make room for what is now the United States of America. Our guest today is Mark Charles, who is a citizen of the Navajo Nation. Mark is a friend, an author, lecturer, and most of all, a very deep thinker. That's why I like having Mark on, and he's not new to Native Bidaske. He's the author of Unsettling Truths, the ongoing Dehumanizing Legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. A few years ago, he wrote an op-ed for Native News Online that we've published several 4th of Julys in a row now. It's called The Dilemma of the 4th of July. We publish it every year, and every year it is well received by our readers. So we thought, what a great time to have Mark on. And welcome, Mark. How are you, sir?
Well, Yate, Levi, thank you for having me. I want to just start by acknowledging, as you said, I'm Diné from the Navajo Nation. I left our reservation, our lands in the Southwest, maybe about 9 years ago to move to what our people call Washington or Washington, D.C., where I live now. We've been here for about 9.5 years, and these are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. And so I just want to honor the Piscataway as the hosts of the lands where I'm living. I want to thank the Piscataway for their stewardship of these lands. And I just want to state and remind myself how humbling it is to be walking, living, breathing, and moving on these lands today. But it's great to be with you, Levi. I'm excited to have the conversation about the 4th of July and obviously the Declaration of Independence.
Well, let me start with that op-ed you wrote, The Dilemma of the 4th of July. Why did you write it? And start with that restaurant out in Gallup, New Mexico. I love that part of the story.
Yeah, well, see, that there's a lot of interesting things. And if people don't know, so in the Declaration of Independence, right, which starts with the phrase, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. It's quoted by most Americans on a regular basis to talk about how this is the land of the free and the home of the brave, and we believe in equality and blah, 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 right? We hear this all the time. But most Americans don't actually read the Declaration of Independence. They know that first line, but they don't know that the Declaration is actually a list of grievances that the colonies had against the King of England. And as you read through those grievances, there's a whole list of them. There's two that really stand out. And the story behind the Declaration of Independence is that in the 1700s, King George draws a line down the Appalachian Mountains. And he essentially says to the 13 colonies that are living here that they no longer have the right of discovery of the empty Indian lands that are west of Appalachia. So the colonies, they're upset about this. And so a few years later, they write a letter of protest. In their letter, they accuse the king of raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. And they go on to state that he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring upon our frontiers the merciless Indian savages. So the Declaration of Independence, 30 lines below the statement, all men are created equal, literally refers to natives as merciless Indian savages. And so in my lectures, in my books, whenever I speak, I always tell people, right, the only reason the founding fathers used that, and I don't want to call them founding fathers, they're not my founding fathers. The reason these founders, these colonists, these settlers use the term all men is because their definition of who was human was actually incredibly narrow. And so for this reason, the Declaration of Independence, right, it actually states some extremely both white supremacist, racist, and sexist, right? It says men, not women. And we all know women didn't even get to write the vote until the 1900s. And so it's not like they can say they're including everybody here. And so I point out to people how this document is a systemically racist, sexist, and white supremacist document, which is surprising to most people. And so I grew up in Gallup, New Mexico, which is a border town to the Navajo Nation. On the weekends especially, so many people. In the Navajo Nation, it's about 26,000 square miles. We have about 300,000 enrolled tribal members. About almost 200,000 live on the reservation. But on the weekends, a lot of the population of the reservation travel to the border towns, places like Flagstaff, Arizona, or Page, Arizona, or Farmington, New Mexico, or Grants, New Mexico, or Gallup, New Mexico, right? And they'll go to the border towns, they'll do their shopping there, they'll visit family, they'll go to the flea market, they'll go to Walmart, right? They'll do all these things in the border towns on the weekends. And so every week you literally see like the payroll of the Navajo Nation get dumped out into the border towns.
The money's not staying on the res. That's for sure.
It's not staying on the res. It's going out into the border towns. And many of these border towns could not exist without the patronage, the business of the Navajo community of our Diné people going to their towns and spending our money there every single weekend. So they are very dependent. But most of these border towns, right, they have both implicit and explicitly racist tendencies within these towns. And so I was sitting in one of the restaurants. It was a steakhouse in Gallup, New Mexico. It was just a few weeks before the 4th of July. And at the time, I don't know who decided this, but someone proclaimed Gallup, New Mexico was the most patriotic small town in the United States of America. There was a big sign on the freeway. Right? It was like the town was really proud of we're the most patriotic town. And again, to understand history, Gallup was literally created because of the railroad that went through. And the room for that railroad, our Navajo people were ethnically cleansed by Abraham Lincoln during the Long Walk, removed from our lands in that area of New Mexico and Arizona, down to Bosque Redondo, down to Fort Sumner. And then we signed a treaty in 1868, which brought us back. And as part of the treaty, this treaty stated that we as Navajo people would not oppose any building of railroads by the U.S. government on our lands. And so the reason Abraham Lincoln committed genocide against our people and ethnically cleansed us was he was working to try and complete Manifest Destiny, to complete the Transcontinental Railway. He was doing this in the northern routes, the central route, and the southern routes of the railway, just massacre after massacre after massacre. And so Gallup was born literally because of this ethnic cleansing. Right? That's why Gallup exists today, because they were intent on building this railway right through Navajo lands, Hopi lands, Zuni lands, and the other nations and tribes that live in that area. And so I was sitting in this restaurant, which is now declaring itself the most patriotic town in all of a small town in all of Gallup, in all of the United States. And I realized that on the wall, and I'd eaten this restaurant before and I hadn't noticed this before, but there was right above me, or right across the way from me, there was a picture of the Declaration of Independence. And I was sitting with a family member, I think, and I said, "Oh, let me show you this." And I walked up to the thing and I showed them where it said.
Go ahead.
I lost you for a moment, I thought. Sorry. And so anyway, I showed them where it literally said 30 lines below the statement of men are created equal. It said merciless Indian savages. And the restaurant was filled with Native peoples, right? It was filled with Navajo people. And I couldn't imagine a situation, right? If we were in the South or if another part of the United States and they had a restaurant that catered to African Americans and that there would be anything hanging in the restaurant using the N-word or doing anything else to discriminate or that overtly against African Americans or any other group of people. But yet here this restaurant was displaying a poster of a document literally calling over half of the patrons in the restaurant savages.
Yes.
And I pointed it out to our waiter, who was also Native. I said, "Did you know that sign, that poster over there, literally calls us savages?" And I think he was kind of worried that I was going to complain or make a big fuss about it. So he actually talked to the manager. The manager came over and spoke to me, and I just kind of said, "It's really ironic, right? That this I mean, if this was any other group of people, that poster would have been taken down and there would have been apologies and there would have been an outroar. But because it was against Natives and because it was literally quoting one of the founding documents of this country, the Declaration of Independence, not only was that poster still hanging there, it was hanging there with pride."
Oh, yes, yes.
And
Well,
so
in the most patriotic small town in America.
in the most and so in the town that was ethnically cleansed, the land that was ethnically cleansed by Abraham Lincoln, considered the greatest president of this country, right? And so it shows you where the values of this nation are. And so that's one of the experiences I had that really kind of led me to my thinking of, we have to do a better job of educating our nation. Right?
Sure.
Again, most Americans never read the Declaration of Independence. They have no clue what it says.
Yeah.
They're shocked when I
stop
point
you
out
there.
to them what it says in the middle of that document.
Yeah. Well, let me stop you there, Mark, because after George Floyd was murdered by the Minneapolis police, and one in particular who's now in prison, across America, monument statues came down. They came toppling down. Confederate soldiers, in some cases, even Columbus statue there up in Minnesota, right at the state capitol. And given that, the outcry was, it's time to make a change. And so some of those monuments came down, and people were kind of okay with it because it's time to really turn a new chapter, so to speak. Now, given the fact that this language is in the Declaration of Independence, you and I both know it will never be changed. So what's the best thing to do? Is have people not display them, or is really a question of, and you've already said the word, educate. Go ahead.
I truly believe this. One of the ways we can address this problem is to educate people. Most people have what I would call an intentional ignorance about American history, about U.S. history. They know there's parts of it that are not good, but they don't want to know what those parts are, right? They want to be ignorant. I say this all the time about Abraham Lincoln. As I mentioned earlier, Abraham Lincoln, and in chapters 9 and 10 of my book, Unsettling Truths, we demonstrate in chapter 9 how until the day he died, Abraham Lincoln was a blatant, unapologetic, self-proclaimed white supremacist. And then in chapter 10, we demonstrate how after the hanging of the Dakota 38 and the removal of the Dakota Winnebago from Minnesota, after the Bear River Massacre and the removal of the Shoshone from northern Utah and southern Idaho, after the Sand Creek Massacre and the removal of the Cheyenne and Arapaho from eastern Colorado, and after the Long Walk and the removal of the Navajo and Mescalero Apache from the Southwest, Abraham Lincoln was literally ethnically cleansing the northern, central, and southern routes of the railway. And he is literally one of the most genocidal presidents in our nation's history. And yet we call him our greatest president.
Mm-hmm. Honest Abe, the whole deal. Yes.
And I tell people, right, I lecture, I have lectures, I bring around the country, the chapters 9 and 10 of our book. I talk about Abraham Lincoln frequently. And I tell people, most Americans know Lincoln. Mm-hmm. Almost everyone knows Lincoln. And most Americans love Lincoln, right? Especially as racial tensions have gotten harder in the last few years and after George Floyd, and there's been more racial tension in the past few decades, right? The stock of Abraham Lincoln has only risen. And at a bipartisan level, he is considered one of our greatest presidents, right? The Republicans love to remind people that they are the party of Lincoln. Mm-hmm. When our first Black president was sworn into office, Barack Obama, he put his hand on the Lincoln Bible, right? Everybody knows Lincoln. Most everybody loves Lincoln. But most people know enough about Lincoln to know they don't want to read the Lincoln-Douglas debates, right? They know there's something in those debates that they don't want to know because it will burst their bubble about who Lincoln is. And so they don't read them. They intentionally ignore them because they don't want to know what's in there. And that's the case with so much of American history, right? They don't want to know how bad it is. They don't want to understand that. And so much of the work I'm doing, the books I'm writing, the videos I produce, the op-eds I write is about how can I educate our nation about who we are and what we've done. So at least if people are going to still continue to, I can't tell people not to celebrate the 4th of July.
Mm-hmm.
But I can educate them on what the Declaration of Independence says and why these documents were written and what their intent was. And then I can leave it up to them what they want to do with that information. And so that's so much of what I'm trying to do, right? There's this quote I use all the time. It was used by George Erasmus when he was writing about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission up in Canada. He said, "Where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community."
Wow.
If you want to build community, the quote says, you must start by creating common memory.
Wow.
And that's what I'm trying to do. Is I'm not trying to cancel people. I'm not trying to even shame people. I'm trying to say, this is who we are as a nation. This is what we've done. Let's find a way to talk about it so we can have a discussion about what we need to do about it.
So say that quote again, is the shared memories.
Yeah. So
that help form community.
Yeah. Where common memory is lacking.
Okay.
Where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want to build community, you must start by creating common memory. And right, this quote, I love the quote because it gets to the heart of our nation's problem, especially regarding race, which is we don't have a common memory, right? We have a majority, a white majority that remembers a mythological history of discovery and expansion, opportunity and exceptionalism. Yeah. We have communities of color, African Americans, Native Americans, other communities of color that have the lived history of stolen lands, broken treaties, enslavement, Indian massacres, Jim Crow laws, internment camps, all these, families being ripped apart at our borders, segregation, mass incarceration. There's no common memory across racial lines. And there's no point in U.S. history that we can look back on and say, oh, we had healthy community across racial lines at this point. It doesn't exist.
No.
We've never had that kind of community. And so this is why I love this quote. That's why I'm teaching this history. That's why I wrote this op-ed, is I am working to build this common memory for the purpose of educating our nation so that we might have a better chance of building, for the very first time, healthier community across racial lines.
Mm-hmm. That's pretty deep. I like that. Now, in your opinion piece, you wrote, as a nation, we embrace this history because we are ignorant of the true nature of our past and never have been accountable for our actions. You kind of alluded to the fact that we ignore that history, but talk about the lack of accountability for our actions as a nation.
In chapters 9 and 10 of our book, Unsettling Truths, just when we're going into the content on Lincoln, we discuss the adage that says the victors write the history. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not a controversial adage, right? Most people agree. If you win a war, you get to write about the war, right? The winners, the victors write the history. And so in the book, we kind of lead people down a thought experiment of, let's imagine that Nazi Germany wins World War II. Let's just pretend they win World War II. How would Nazi historians how would they have written about the legacy of Hitler? Mm-hmm. Well, he'd be their greatest leader ever, right? Brought them from global obscurity to global dominance. Had they won World War II, how would their historians have written about the legacy of the Holocaust? Well, we have people who deny the Holocaust today. Imagine if Nazis won the war. It'd be what Holocaust? There was no Holocaust. And then we point out one of the challenges of the United States of America is it's never lost a war that matters, right? We've never lost a war. And we've been at war for almost our entire history. We've been in a declared state of war, our armed military conflict against other nations and states, including native nations, almost since our founding. We just finished a decades-long war in Afghanistan, right? I mean, we are constantly at war, and we've never lost a war that matters. Technically, the Korean War isn't over. We pulled out of Vietnam. We pulled out of Afghanistan. We didn't lose any land there. We had our pride hurt a little bit. We didn't lose any of our core lands. We've won every major military conflict we've been a part of as a nation, which means for 250 years, white landowning men have been able to write their own history. And so what we point out in chapters 9 and 10, and what I'm pointing out here, the point I'm trying to make here is just like what we said Nazi Germany would have done with Hitler and would have done with the legacy of the Holocaust, this is exactly what we've done with people like Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, our Declaration of Independence, and our Constitution, is we've taken these racist, sexist, white supremacist figures, foundations, and documents, and we've made them into these biblical, proportional, like words of God and acts of God.
We've glorified them.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
And it's because we've never lost a war. We've never been invaded. We've never given up large tracts of land. We've never been disarmed. We've never had a regime change. And so we've never had to look back on our history and say, oh, we probably shouldn't have done that, right? We still to this day celebrate the fact that we ended World War II by dropping nuclear bombs on civilians in Japan.
Yeah.
We've never been held accountable to that.
Yeah, look at the success of Oppenheimer last year.
We've never been held accountable for the massacres, the centuries of massacres we committed against Native peoples. We've never been held accountable for that. In 2020, or in 2022, and in 2020, the Supreme Court literally stated that at any point Congress wants, all they have to do is express their intent, and they can break a treaty with Native nations on a whim, and no one, including the Supreme Court, will hold them accountable.
Mm-hmm.
This is the challenge, is we have never as a nation lost a war that matters, which means white landowning men have written their own history for 250 years, which means we have never been held accountable for the centuries of ethnic cleansing, enslavement, genocide, and other atrocities that we've committed as they built this empire known as the United States of America.
Yeah. And Mark, and you've already said it, we talked about it real briefly, but I want to talk about it a little more. Do you ever get tired? Because it seems to me that a lot of Native Americans, especially those who are really involved, ours is a plight of constantly having to educate the non-native as to who we are, what we care about, what our concerns are. Do you ever get tired of it? Talk about that.
I will admit it gets very tiring, especially when you run up against what I call the intentional ignorance, where it's not only people don't know, they're resistant to know, they don't want to know. Mm-hmm. And so it's a constant effort of how do I talk about this history in a way that is honest and blunt and straightforward. It doesn't excuse the past, it doesn't justify it, but it also teaches it in a spirit that the people who are opposed to it can still hear it. Mm-hmm. And that is, to me, what, at times gets the most tiring, is trying to figure out how do I present this information in a way that my nation can hear it. Mm-hmm. And not only just hear it, but engage with it. And so this is where in the past I've done a lot of things where I look at what I call the trauma of white America and other obstacles white Americans have to hearing and understanding their own history. I mean, this is a constant part of my work. I'm constantly rethinking, reevaluating. One of the things I'm just doing now, and I'll share this briefly here. It was about 25 years ago. I moved with my family from Denver, Colorado, back to the Navajo Nation, and I decided to do something that my people, our Navajo people, have been doing for centuries, but I had never done before, which is waking up in the morning and greeting the sunrise with my prayers. And I started doing it back then. And I wrote about this extensively in the introduction to the book, Unsettling Truths. And had I known at the time what an amazing spiritual transformation that would be in my life, I would have probably never guessed it would have happened. Right? The sunrise is always beautiful. It's beautiful when you wake up, you have an early morning flight, or maybe you wake up some morning just to watch the sunrise, and you'll see it a few times a year, and it's always breathtaking when you see it. But when you wake up, morning after morning, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, and eventually decade after decade, it teaches you something deep in your soul about Creator, about your relationship with Creator, and about your place in this world. And it's incredibly humbling as you see the birds and the animals migrate and move in conjunction with the sun, as you see the winds and the rains and the snows and the flowers and all these things coming and going season after season. And after a while, you begin to realize you have very little control. You can't make the sunrise happen faster. You can't make it come slower, right? It happens every day. Even if it's behind the clouds, it happens. And sometimes you can't even see it, but it happens and you can't control it. And after a few years or even decades, you begin to feel at peace in that place of not having control. And it's that peace that I credit with giving me the courage to look at the history of the Doctrine of Discovery. And so when I am trying to educate our nation about this history, and I culminated that a few years ago in 2020 when I ran for president. I was literally in my campaign. My goal was to build a nation where we the people actually means all the people. And I was trying to get our nation to deal with its history and our foundations. And I was ignored. I was left out of debates. I was left out of conversations. I was written out of stories by the media, right? It was unbelievable how intentional the country was. We don't want to talk about those things. And after that campaign, as I was kind of reevaluating what I was doing and how I was going to go about it, I realized how important watching the sunrise was for me and in my journey to be able to deal with the uncertainty and even the overwhelming injustice of our history and the absolute utter feeling of being out of control in the midst of all of that. And I realized if I want my nation to deal with this same history, I have to at least invite them into this practice, this discipline of watching the sunrise. And so it was after the election, and I began very intentionally watching the sunrise here on Piscataway lands in Washington, D.C., going to the Potomac River and greeting it. This is during COVID, right? Morning after morning as it comes up over the river. And I began live streaming those sunrises every morning. And I would invite people to come and join me or to watch it later. But I was literally, in a way, trying to invite the nation to mentor, disciple, teach the nation. If we want to deal with these overwhelming parts of our history of who we are and what we've done, we need to also have this discipline of understanding better who Creator is and how we relate to Creator in this world we're living in. And there's no better way to do that. You don't learn that from reading a book. You learn that from watching the sunrise.
Wow, that's pretty powerful.
And so this is right. This is one of the things I'm doing now as I continue to invest in these things. Is when I do watch the sunrise, I still continue to live stream it. If you go on my YouTube channel, you'll see dozens, if not hundreds, of videos up there of the sunrises from over the past several years. If you go to my Facebook feed, you'll see decades worth of pictures of sunrises from before the campaign, because before that I always take a picture of it, and after I took videos of it. And yeah, this is my way of inviting the country into a discipline that I'm hoping will give us the strength, the courage, the peace, and the humility we need to confront our history and who we are, what we've done, and how we became who we are today.
Well, thank you very much, Mark Charles. Chimigwich. To our viewers, we're really talking to author Mark Charles, the NA member, talked about the dilemma of the 4th of July. And we'll be back next week with another episode of Native Bidaske. In the meantime, hug your grandparents, hug your young ones, and let's show love and peace for one another across Indian country and across the United States of America. Chimigwich. We'll see you next week.
Thank you, Levi.
If you appreciate what we do here at Native News Online, we invite you to donate to support our continued work covering Indian country. You can scan this code with your smartphone or go to the link located below this video to donate today. We greatly appreciate your support. Please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And be sure to scan this code or go to the link below to subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you for joining us today, and please be sure to join us again next week for another episode of Native Bidaske. Chimigwech.